Hi there, and welcome to the channel of A Disappointed Man with me, Jason Kennedy, the Disappointed Man. And in this video, I'll be speaking about getting into the works of Thomas Bernhard. But before that, a subscriber count update. Now, last time I was appealing for someone to step forward and be subscriber number 14, and a person did duly step forward and make that happen. And now we've moved on to 16 subscribers, so I've set a fresh goal of 20 subscribers by the end of the year. So if you haven't yet done so, please consider clicking on subscribe and perhaps even clicking the like button and help to make this channel grow. Okay, so the motivation for this video was I was recently listening to a literary podcast, and it was a discussion of a book by Thomas Bernhard called The Loser, which is one of his best books, and it was some American gentlemen, and they were having an awful time. They were just scratching their heads trying to engage with this book, and what they were foundering upon was some basic questions. Why is this book written the way it is? What is going on? And is this really a literary work of art, or is it just the unedited ravings of a madman? What is it? Is there anything really going on in the work of Thomas Bernhard? Now, of course, for me, I'm a great admirer of the work of Thomas Bernhard. I was introduced to it by a German friend of mine who is very fortunate because he can read them in the original. But in 1999, while we were at university, he introduced me to these books, and I started with The Loser actually. And since then, I have read them and reread them, and I'm actually completing my graduate thesis at the moment, and I did choose a Bernhard book as one of the primary texts. I chose his excellent biography, Gathering Evidence, and I wrote about one volume of this where he is in the hospital with lung disease, and technically it is an incredibly well done piece of writing. So there's my position. I'll openly declare that Thomas Bernhard is one of my favorite writers, and I spent a considerable amount of time sort of considering his work and thinking about it, and that is what I'm going to share with you, because his work doesn't belong to the main tradition that we're familiar with when we go into the bookshop and pick up these kinds of classic works that all operate within or hark back to their 19th century forebears. So if we went into the bookstore, where are these examples here that I wanted to show? Oh yes. Yeah, these works that hark back to their 19th century forebears, even A Single Man. It is heavily influenced by Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, but it still retains a strong link to what came before it in the 19th century novel, as does Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. You could read Isherwood and then Conrad, and then you could jump to D.H. Lawrence, Women in Love, without any problem whatsoever. But Bernhard's novels don't fit within this tradition, and there's none of the kinds of use of scenes or descriptions of landscapes or descriptions of what people look like. All of that is absent. There is no direct quotation, which we'll come on to. That's one of the things people find strange. And his works are often referred to as, they are single paragraphs. You know, if I flick through them, you know, this can be, for some readers, I don't mean to be condescending because I don't know the demographics of my channel. And everyone has to start somewhere with their literary journey. And it can be daunting for some people to pick up works and to flick through them and see there are no chapters there. Life doesn't have chapters, does it? The chapter is a convention. It's something that reminds us perhaps of the stage with its acts and its scenes. But It's not there here, is it? So this can seem daunting, you know, even when the novel is relatively short. So I think that's one of the things. Is just, it's like having the like riding the bicycle when you're learning to ride it, and then Dad snatches away or takes away the stabilizers and gives you that push. There's those moments of like this, you know, am I going to fall? Am I going to hurt myself? Can I do this? That is kind of what happens when people pick up these Bernhard novels. So what I'll do is I'll just talk about what they are instead of what they're not. So just a little note on the narrative structure of these, and they, at the most basic level, and you find this repeated in all of Bernhard's novels, all of them, without exception. They all feature a split into two figures. I got it written down here by a great article from this Gargoyles guy that I used. A split into two figures, one of which, a teller self, an observing self, reports sentences uttered by another person. Yeah, and this is a central structure of Bernhard's novels. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So that teller self and the self being observed could be the same person. Okay? So a person will write about themselves, but in a way where they don't really have any kind of privileged access to themselves. You know, it's linked with this the work. It's very much like what you find in the philosophy of language of Wittgenstein. This splitting, the only way to really look at yourself is to detach the self you are now from a previous self, and then that self is really no different to another person. Yes, so that is one reason why there's a seamless transition in Bernhard between his fictions and his biography. They use exactly the same methods. Okay, when he writes about himself, it's exactly how he would have to treat a fictional self. So let's look at one of the simple examples where he uses this. So concrete, and this is because this is the most basic form that this narrative technique takes. This is why I usually recommend concrete as the place to start with Thomas Bernhard. So I think actually, even if you're just coming here wondering which Bernhard novel to read first, you might already have had quite a lot of value added to what you do next by just taking this recommendation, because the loser, which the other gentlemen were talking about, is for me not really the place to start. This is better because it takes a single person and splits them into the telling self and the self who is observed. In this case, it is a man who is trying to write a work of musicology about the composer Mendelssohn Bartholdy, and despite having spent many years on this project, he's made absolutely no progress whatsoever beyond accumulating an enormous amount of source material. But he hasn't yet managed to write even the first sentence of his work. And so one thing that also comes out here, which is used a few times, is the basic narrative technique, and one of Bernhard's ideas that he uses a few times, which is the artist who can no longer create, the writer who cannot write. So you in effect get a book about trying to write a book. Okay, so it's got this idea is used at least twice in his novels, just speaking offhand. It's also used in this one. And in this one, the book that he's trying to write also has some kind of impossible qualities or aspects to it. It's a guy who, with his wife, has moved into the lime works, which give it its title. And he's trying to write a book about hearing called The Sense of Hearing. And it's clearly an insane project. And he's got some insane ideas, and he does these bizarre experiments with his wife, which amount to a kind of spousal abuse. Just to emphasize how impossible his project is, there is the hardest chapter, the most difficult one of his book, when he's outlining the plan, has, after 2 years of contemplating this chapter, it still has no title. which really speaks to the sheer impossibility of materializing his aims. So those two are where you could start. And then what happens is in the other novels, it just varies this narrative technique and explores it in different ways. So one thing you'll get is a series of observers. So you get one person observing another, and then reports going backwards and forwards. And in the height of this is probably Old Masters, which is billed as a comedy and is one of his funniest fictions. And in here you get this very bizarre setup where a man has arranged with another man who works in a museum that he wishes to observe while unobserved another man. And this go-between has agreed a kind of that he will not betray any sign that he is aware of this arrangement when the other man appears. And the other man who's being observed behaves as if this go-between doesn't exist at all and is not. So, and then the reports pass backwards and forwards between them. I think the idea here is, in terms of why you would do this, it's, as I say, it's linked to this idea of there being no kind of private language. And so instead, we learn more when we observe another than we would learn from observing ourselves. There's this idea, there's this kind of blind spot, this point on the back of your head that we're not aware of. And so the complete person is actually the one that's being observed rather than the observer. This is one of the reasons Bernhard sets this up. Now, there's two more ideas from the way it's written as these reports then, which I'll kind of touch on. And these quite simple, but the first one is that if you're reporting the words of someone else, then when you pass them along, they're in a kind of relay. And you have this issue with how do you distinguish your stance on what you're repeating from the person who said it prior to you. And so that is a problem. If you're reporting that someone said X about Y, then when you say he said X about, are you endorsing this? Actually, in social media, we have this idea of where people kind of disown the content of retweets, or say a disclaimer that a retweet is not an endorsement. You know, so we're familiar with this now in our discourse, and Bernhard is super engaged with this because he wants to mount a critique, and his works are very much exercises in criticism. They are devastating critiques of society. So what happens is this teleself has to face the fact that the sentences they report are unavoidably a mixture of both true and false descriptions of the world, which circulate through quotation. And so one of the features of Bernhard's fictions that you don't really find anywhere else is that he has a whole apparatus for signaling to the reader when the person who's passing on what someone else said doesn't agree, is registering their disagreement. You know, it's essential because the analysis is trying to tease apart the false from the true, the error from the true. So in Bernhard, there's this, for example, the use of italics. So if a word, he's objecting to a word that he's reporting, then it will be placed into italics. And you'll think, why is this in italics? This is why. It's to signal that the teller self does not subscribe to the reporting self's view of what this means. And then similarly, even more obviously, is the use of the word so-called. So-called. So he will talk about being invited to a so-called artistic dinner, or a so-called, prize giving, like this. So a so-called doctor, a so-called architect. So this allows this teller self to begin to distance himself from the language that is constantly circulating. So this again is very important when you think about today's sort of landscape when we're debating things. It's very difficult to criticize the use of particular terms without also looking as if you're kind of endorsing them. So Bernhard has all this there in what he's doing. And that leads me on to sort of another point, which is, why is there so much kind of madness in Bernhard? Why is madness, suicide, death, why are they so present in his work? And again, it relates to this idea that everything is a kind of quotation, everything is a citation. Because if we take that view, then what we'll find is that madness is kind of a key. It plays a key role, because madness can disrupt or break this chain, this citational chain. So the mad person, in their nonsensical statements, these statements are not attributable to previous speakers. And in fact, it's this very lack of this discernible link to a prior utterance which makes something appear mad. It's what defines it as mad. So instead, what you hear when the mad person speaks is kind of language itself, would be the idea. And there is one of his early novels, which I'm not going to recommend you would start with. This is one of the later ones, is Gargoyles. And this has a famous set piece, which is, it has a sort of a take on Joyce's famous Molly Bloom monologue, I suppose. It might be seen as some kind of attempt to come up with something as impressive. So it has this mad prince. There's also a Hamlet theme when it's kind of wandering around on the battlements, is where this speech is delivered. But it has this like 100 and something page monologue by the mad Prince Sauron. And for the prince, what's interesting here is that this prince is in the grip of a kind of citational madness. And what I say here is, it parodies and extends the literary techniques that Bernhard himself uses. And so for the prince, madness, like language, is a form of citation, being not just a personal possession, but in his case, forming part of a family inheritance. And he spends his time trying to communicate these fatal noises in his head. And when he does so, he quotes his dead father's speculation on the source of these noises. You've got these kind of transgenerational disturbances in the person's perceptions, which could be sort of like language itself is this transgenerational kind of phenomena. And then, after saying that his father describes as kind of rumblings in the earth, then out comes this description of his own: eruption of water into what has been parched from time immemorial. It's just like, feels like this poetic kind of word salad that he's using there. So that is why we've got with the two notions together. One, everything that's said is already saying something that has previously been said. It has this link, so we're in this citational chain. But secondly, the madness is a way to break that chain. And then also, when you speak, when you want to mount a critique, you have to be distancing yourself for the purpose of analysis from just the common use of these words, from their common received meanings. And there again, it attaches itself to Wittgenstein's formulation that the meaning, the limits of my language means the limits of my world. Yeah, it's a lot to take in. I've reached this point, sort of investigating these novels and making my recommendation there, and I think I just devote the last little part to just picking some of them up and just saying a bit more about how they're patterned, and I can just introduce you to some more, and you could see which ones might take your fancy. Now, another one is this one, Wittgenstein's Nephew. Now, this is another one, like Concrete, is a more or less perfect introduction to Thomas Bernhard's work. It's even shorter than Concrete. And this one is not, this one is, the Wittgenstein's Nephew is Paul, who is mad. So just as Ludwig Wittgenstein was a great philosopher, Paul is a great madman. And I'll read a little bit of this one. And actually, this part where the narrator is in hospital recovering from an operation, and he's discussing his friendship with Paul. That's been the defining relationship in his life. And Paul is in another part of the hospital, but they can't visit one another because Paul is in a part for the people that are suffering from mental illness, and so they're not allowed to have any visitors, and they're not allowed to leave. But I think this little part here, is this the right page? Oh yes, it kind of reflects back on Bernhard's project. That's why I read this. So he says here about Paul is planning to produce this literary work. Again, it never is produced. It just remains as like just some notes. But he starts writing poetry when his attempts in prose are just fall into pieces. So just before being readmitted to one of his madhouses, he would read out the longest of them, of these poems, to anyone willing to listen. There is a tape recording of this poem which centers upon himself and Goethe's Faust. Listening to it, one is highly amused and at the same time deeply disturbed. Now this could be a description, you see, of Bernhard's works in terms of their effect. I could recount not just hundreds but thousands of Paul's anecdotes in which he is the central figure. They are famous in the so-called upper reaches of Viennese society to which he belonged, and which, as everybody knows, have lived on such anecdotes for centuries. So there again, so-called, being employed to distance himself from this phrase, the upper reaches of Viennese society, to indicate his kind of contempt for this group. But I will refrain from doing so. He was a restless character who always lived on his nerves and was perpetually out of control. He was a brooder, endlessly philosophizing and endlessly accusing. Now this also is characteristic of the Bernhard narrator, the constant philosophizing and the constant accusations that accompany it. He was also an incredibly well-trained observer, and over the years he developed his gift for observation to a fine art. He was the most ruthless observer and constantly found occasion to accuse. Nothing escaped his accusing tongue. Again, this is Thomas Bernhard. Those who came under his scrutiny survived only a very short time before being savaged once they had drawn suspicion, italicized here, upon themselves and become guilty of some crime, or at least of some misdemeanor. He would lambast them with the same words that I myself employ when I am roused to indignation. And again, Thomas Bernhard, instead of being a misanthrope, he's sometimes characterized as the outraged moralist. You know, like we'd find in someone like Jonathan Swift, is propelling his critique. When I'm forced to defend myself and take action against the insolence of the world in order not to be put down and annihilated by it. Yeah, here in that passage, it really encapsulates so much about what Bernhard is doing in his writing. It is Bernhard against the world, and the world brings the language, and you are forced to use that language. But how do you turn it against itself so you can turn it against the world? How can you avoid simply accepting things the way they are, words the way they are? How are you going to break with this and become, who you should be and say the things that you want to say? That is the central kind of mission in all of Bernhard's fiction. Now, I hope looking at the clock there, that I've said enough to get you interested in Bernhard, and also to make you a little less anxious about doing so. If I could just get one person to pick up one of his books and read it and enjoy an experience that they had never previously envisaged themselves having, then that would be enough. That would be enough. That would be enough reward for me, having made this video. So I'm going to wrap up here, and until the next time, keep it real, keep it foolish, and nano nano.